On the 5th of April 2026, the 25 to 26 tax year will come to an end, and with it also ends some major tax planning opportunities. If you do nothing, you will miss out on some of these tax planning opportunities. So, on today's podcast, we're going to help you get a plan to maximize the opportunity before the tax year ends. This is going to be especially relevant if you are earning around £100,000, especially if you're using tax-free childcare. If you're earning around £200,000 and you're worried about the tapered annual allowance, if you're worried about your annual allowance pensions tax charge, the dreaded brown envelope, or if you're using a SIP as well as your NHS pensions. If you want our help to sort out this mess before the end of the tax year, before it's too late, then head to the show notes where you'll find a link to our new course, or go to medicsmoney.co.uk/pension. On today's podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by two of this country's best experts. Dr. Tony Goldstone is a consultant radiologist and the former National Clinical Advisor to the BMA on pay and pensions, and a well-known pensions guru. And also joining forces, we have Mr. Andy Pow, who has, by his own admission, been a specialist medical accountant for absolutely years, working with Medics Money now as well. Chaps, welcome to the podcast. We're doing this one in a hurry because the clock is really ticking here, and a lot of people are going to miss out on some valuable tax planning opportunities. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Welcome.
Cheers, Tommy. Thanks for the invite. Good to be back on the podcast.
Absolutely. Good to be back. Hello, everyone.
So let's just get straight into it, right? Why could annual allowance be an issue in the current 26, easy for me to say, tax year, which ends in really soon on the 5th of April? Why could this be an issue?
We haven't got time on this podcast to go into the mechanics of annual allowance, so we're going to make the assumption that those listening and interested in this topic will have some idea, but obviously check back many podcasts, including ones done with Tony, on the issue. Why is it a problem in 2025-26? Well, we just need to backdate to when it last changed, the annual allowance regime, and that was in the March 2023 budget, Jeremy Hunt's last budget. He upped the allowance at that point in time to £60,000, which was good. And the idea of that was it was going to bring the majority of medics out of the scope of annual allowance. However, the one thing they did keep the same was the 200,000 limit at which a tapering calculation can kick in from. Moving rapidly forward, what's happened since then is those limits have not changed. We've had inflation go up quite sizably. So, if your income has kept a pace with inflation, and we'll talk about inflation separately in a second, then obviously your income will go up, which is going to push people more towards the 200,000 barrier. And just a reminder, for annual allowance purposes, 200,000 barrier is based on all your income. It's not just solely your NHS income. So if you've got private practice, you've got rental income, investment income, you have to take all those things into account. So we've seen that side of things grow. What we've also seen is inflation has yo-yoed over that period as well. And inflation yo-yoing is not particularly good when it comes to the pensions annual allowance because of how it interacts with pay. From a GP perspective, less so. It's more predictable these days in terms of trying to model your growth. And there is, because that's always had an element of inflation protection with it. But for those in the hospital sector on the officers scheme, inflation is a crucial part of the annual allowance calculation, and mainly in relation to those legacy scheme benefits that people have. With those, what we have seen happen is we had a period of very low pay uplifts, which were way below inflation, and then followed by a period where there have been some pay uplifts and adjustments to people's pay. Arguably, we're not going to get into this. That still needs more to come. So we could, see another further round of that coming through. But where you have pay uplifts below inflation, actually it dampens down the pension growth. Where you have pay uplifts way above inflation, it increases the pension growth. So what we've seen is low pension growth, high pension growth, high pension growth. What you can do is you can look back the previous 3 years for any unused relief. And that's why a lot of people actually haven't as yet hit actual annual allowance tax charges, because some of this would have come through in the 24-25 year. But it does eat into that unused relief brought forward from those low pay uplift years. That starts to drift away. So we're now in a point where a lot of people in 2025-26 will get caught by pensions annual allowance tax charges, particularly if you're at that consultant level, because of that dynamic impacting with inflation. So if you haven't dealt with it before, do not ignore it this year. Probably the second issue to talk about, because it doesn't annual allowance doesn't affect just the high earners. Don't just assume it's an issue for high earners. The second issue is around the tax levels and the £100,000 tax level. And if you remember, the £100,000 tax level results in several things happening. Firstly, you start to lose your tax-free personal allowance, which means a marginal rate of tax in England of 60%, Wales 6%, Northern Ireland 60%, Scotland 67.5%. But secondly, it also impacts for people that are using childcare allowances and free childcare, depending on which country you're in, because it does vary per country. There are various impacts of that. So it can be a sizable problem for people around that level of income who are using childcare. And one of the ways you can try and mitigate that and try and bring yourself below the 100,000 level. There's various ways of looking at this, but the two fairly obvious ways are gift aid contributions help. But the second one is paying more into pension and maybe taking out a SIP style pension where you're just investing pensions in the stock market or various funds. But to do that, you need to have assessed your NHS pension growth, because if you don't know what your NHS pension growth is, you don't know what the availability is to pay into the SIP. And what you don't want to do is combine the two and suddenly find you've gone above the limits and have a tax charge to pay. So it's relevant now because of the inflation impact, but relevant now because all these limits have also been frozen. So as time goes on, more and more people get caught.
Yeah, just one more thing to add about this year in particular, the 25-26 tax year, is one of the other changes that Jeremy Hunt made, which is something that I know you and I, Andy, have been campaigning on for almost a decade, is something called negative growth. So from 23-24, we get the benefit of negative growth to be able to offset one scheme versus the other. And for lots of hospital doctors in particular, that will have meant that they had big negative growth, which created lots of carry forward to offset against the 24-25 tax year. So for many, and myself included, I had a 5-figure tax charge in 24-25. That will have meant a tax charge, but very much reduced by that negative growth from 23-24. That is out the window, unfortunately, for the current 25-26 tax year. So people might not have the benefit of having all of that carry forward. So for me personally, although my pay proportionally went up a lot less in 25-26, my tax charge is going to be much higher, almost 3 times the level than it was in 24-25, because I didn't have any of that carry forward available. And that's why it's just so important to know your numbers and know where you are with all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just also demonstrates just how complicated this is. We're going to talk about a solution to the complexity in a moment. But I think like the main take homes from what Andy just said as well is, there's a lot you can do to mitigate this, but you need to be really sure about your NHS pension growth before you think about adding any more pension contributions, whether that's via the SIP or whatever. Okay, so Tony, if you haven't calculated your annual allowance, do you just sit back, wait for the brown envelope to come, hope, guess, or is there another way?
Okay, well, so I think there's a number of points in there, Tommy, that are relevant. Andy's just explained very nicely that there's some things that you can do during the tax year. And the brown envelopes, even if everything is working as it should, only arrive typically in October after the tax year is closed. So if you're waiting for the brown envelope to take action during the tax year, it's clearly too late, because the brown envelope came 6 months after the tax year. But that's if everything is working optimally. And we know that over the last couple of years, all of the schemes in England and Wales and pretty much across the public sector have really struggled with McLeod. So many people are seriously out of date in terms of receiving their brown envelopes. So there's at least 20,000 people that haven't received RPSSs. That's the bit that covers, the growth from 2015 through to the 22-23 tax year. And I suspect that 20,000 is a big underestimate. I think there's probably many more than that, and that affects people in all nations. So people may not know their position going back many years because of the lack of brown envelopes. So what you really need to do to take control of the situation is know your numbers. And the key word in that is your, because, one of the things that I was kind of constantly asked about in the BMA is, can we produce a couple of examples so people can get a kind of ballpark of where they are? And it just doesn't work, because even if your twin brother or sister, went to medical school and followed a very similar career to you, little tiny nuanced things like the month that they were appointed can make an enormous difference to pension taxation. So you cannot, say, but the elder consultants in my department, or my senior GPs weren't affected by A this year, so therefore I don't need to do anything. It's a very individualized thing based on your income, your carry forward position, the growth of your pension relative to inflation, and all of those things are calculable. But you need to do the work. And so, broadly speaking, you've kind of got two options. You can either pay someone to do it, and there's lots of people out there that will do that and provide an expert service for you, but they will charge good money to do that. And the other thing that you can do is use modeling software such as the tools that I produce. So that is kind of a bit of a middle ground between doing nothing and paying an expert to do it. You can kind of take control of it yourself. And one of the things that I've always fostered, in the decade I've been in this sphere and the BMA Goldstone model, etc., is, the more and more people take control of it, the more that they're able to act and do something about it. And so, yes, you can rely on paying somebody for annual advice, but you're in a much stronger position if you try and up your own education, get a handle on it, and then use these tools so you know your numbers. And also, I think some people have a bit of an irrational fear about annual allowances. Some people choose to kind of bury their head in the sand because it's in the kind of too difficult pile, and they're worried that it's going to be catastrophically bad. And it might not be nearly as bad as you think about, and so a good way of getting sleep at night is by absolutely knowing your numbers, where you are this year, knowing where you are next year, crucially knowing that if you can do anything about it. And everyone will sleep much better at night if they're in that position, Tommy.
Yeah, definitely. Like, it is complicated, but you're smart doctors. You can do this, and it's so tempting. You're busy, you're on call, other things happening. Like, it's easy to bury your head in the sand, but we're not talking about small mistakes here. We're talking about massive amounts of money, and everyone's situation is different. And I guess the key thing is that there's so much that you can do, but you got to do something, whether that's hire an expert and get them to do the whole lot, do it yourself using a calculator, or what I'm going to call the third way, which is the course that we're doing together, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the link is in the description. But before we talk about that, let's just say you've calculated your numbers and it shows that you have an annual allowance charge. Is there anything that you can do to mitigate the impact of that?
Yeah, so there's kind of broadly three areas that I'm going to kind of cover here. So one is kind of modifying what you do, so i.e. Changing the amount that you work. Two is going to be making pension contributions to a private pension. And I know that can seem, disingenuous, that if you've got a problem with high pension growth, then putting more into a pension doesn't always seem logical, but in certain circumstances, it can make complete sense. And then, of course, the third option is you just take it on the chin and pay it, either through self-assessment or via scheme pay. So kind of taking each one of those in turn, the working less. So unfortunately, with our tax system, we're in a position where, very stupidly, in my view, there are certain situations like, Andy described the 100K situation, where you can either get into very high marginal rates, but even worse, you can get yourself in a position where you are paying to work. So, just picking some numbers out of the air, if you get tax-free childcare worth, let's say, £8,000, and it's just a simple yes or no, you go over 100K, either of the parents, and then you've lost that £8,000 overnight, there's going to be a pretty broad part of the earning spectrum where you are out of pocket by going over that. So if people have crunched the numbers, they may find that their net position after income tax, national insurance, and loss of tax-free childcare is better by working less. And I know that's a really stupid position for the government to be in when we have a productivity crisis and huge waiting lists. But for some people, it will be better for them to work less. And exactly the same, sadly, is also true at kind of the other end of the, the higher earning GP and consultant spectrum. So those that are flirting with 200k, again, there's a tax cliff that if you fall over that tax cliff, you're in big problems where you can end up paying to work. So you can only kind of navigate those sort of things if you understand your income position and you understand your growth. SIP is a really good way, even if you're into annual allowance charges, for example, above the 200k limit, if you can't reduce your income. So let's say you're at 205 and you had no way of reducing that, maybe it's towards the end of the tax year and there's nothing you can do about it, you're stuck with that income that's over that limit. You can use a SIP to reduce your taxable income to below that level, and you can still find that overall your tax charge will be lower, even if you're within the scope of annual allowance. But again, crucially, that's all about knowing your numbers. And last but not least is scheme pays. And scheme pays has changed quite a lot over the years. And I started getting annual allowance charges in my early 40s, and the prospect of having scheme pays loans every year till retirement was terrifying. But lots has changed. The annual allowance has gone from 40 to 60. The additional rate on top of inflation as an interest rate has come down. The conversion factors have become more favourable. And so, again, it's about understanding scheme pays. What will I be left in terms of pension by just taking the charge on the nose, so to speak, paying it via scheme pays? You'll still be better off than coming out of the scheme. So it's all about empowering yourself with knowledge to know what the options are. Andy, I don't know whether you had any other.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing to think about is also if you may have a limited company, and a lot of doctors do have a sort of sideline limited company, which they try and extract money out through dividends. And what we've got coming up is a change in the dividend tax regime that's going to increase rates, not for all levels of income, but at some levels of income on the 6th of April 2026. So you might be tempted to bring dividends forward and get them into this tax year to pay less tax. But if that then trips you over the 100,000 allowance, then you just need to be mindful of that. And remember that both the 100,000 problem and the 200,000 tapering problem is based on the entirety of your income. It's not just your NHS incomes. Managing the entirety of your other income in a more tax efficient way is a consideration that you need to take.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that some people forget as well, that now we're having a lot more people take on retire and return and partial retirement, is that retirement income is also taxable income. So we're seeing people who were kind of high earners, but perhaps never in the range where they were tapered previously. And then all of a sudden they've got pension income, and then perhaps 90% of their earnings before. And then all of a sudden they're also now kind of having to navigate this tax trap whilst they remain in, almost full-time work plus their pension. So it all goes into the mix. Dividends, bank interest, private practice income that's extracted, it all goes into the mix. And that's why it's really important to know your numbers, particularly at this time of year, just before the end of the tax year, to see whether or not you're close and there's anything you can do to mitigate.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was an amazing whistle-top summary of the problems. Thank you so much to you both. So in terms of what you can do about this, I can say option one, do nothing. Regrettably, I think a lot of our colleagues will take that option. I know they do, and I know that Tony sees this as well. And we get it. Everyone's busy, it's complicated. So I'm going to assume you're not in the do nothing category because you're listening to this podcast. So that's good. Option two, it has always been possible to use specialist advisors to calculate these numbers for you and mitigate these charges and advise you. And of course, you need a specialist like those on Medic's Money. And for many, many people, that may be the best option for sure. But now, for the first time, there is a third way, which is if you want to get, in detail education about this, learn about the issues, learn about, what is your tax traps and what is your adjusted net income, and some support to calculate your numbers, then we got the third way, which is our new course, which is launching very, very soon, just before the tax year. So we say like this is the last chance to do something about it this tax year.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The course we've designed is, I mean, Tony and I have exchanged lots of things over the years and done various webinars and things like that. And it comes back to common themes. And the common themes to me are always, firstly, you need to have a knowledge of how your pension grows. And that is, everyone kind of assumes that people know that, but people don't. So you always have to start by going back to basics of actually making sure people 100% know how their pension grows in the various different scenarios. Because as Tony said, they can change quite rapidly. You're in a GP practice and think it's exactly the same between all the partners. It won't be because of just different dynamics going on. But building on that, you then have to understand the pension growth and how that's calculated and methodologies and tools you can use to do that. And then, looking at probably in a bit more detail than we've covered today, some of the options open to you. And they're not always going to be perfect solutions. And there is a perfect solution to this unless the government decide to change the tax regime, which to me is the perfect solution. But I think that's beyond myself and Tony's capabilities to persuade them of that to do that at the moment.
You have tried over the years, to be fair.
We have tried, but yeah.
And we have achieved a lot, but I think it's gone a long way. I don't think it's going to go much further very quickly.
So really it's about gaining some knowledge, really, out of which you can then decide what the best options for you. And that may still be, I need to talk to an advisor on that. But at least you go in, as Tony said, going into a discussion where you actually understand the problem and actually understand some understanding of the numbers makes it far easier to then explore all the issues with someone because well, that might work, that might not work. So yeah, that's what we're trying to achieve this time round.
Yeah, and of course, by educating yourself, it's about creating a long-term situation where you understand how your work pattern interacts with the growth, and so it's not kind of a last-minute scramble at the end of the tax year requiring expensive advice. It's about kind of putting you back into the driving seat, knowing your numbers, how to use the modelling tools, how to estimate your growth, and put yourself in the best position as early as possible in the tax year to be able to make informed decisions. Definitely got to be better than doing nothing or being completely reliant on advice year in, year out. Because unfortunately, once you're in a position where you start getting charges, it's usually a recurrent problem. It's not something that you get as a one-off. Usually, it's usually a recurrent problem. So if you're getting them in your late 30s, early 40s, or even early 50s, you might have this problem for another 10 years. So arming yourself with that knowledge is crucially important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just do something. Okay. And that's why we're doing the course. We're making it easy as possible for you we can support you through it. You're going to hang out with a load of like-minded doctors who are all striving towards the same goal. We've got the experts there to help you if you need it and everything that you need. So the link for the course is in the show notes. It's medicsmoney.co.uk/pension. The clock really is ticking here. Whatever you do something. If you've got colleagues who you think might be affected by this, just share this podcast with them. It might be the first time they've ever had any education about their finances because doctors don't get much education about their finances. We're all in this together. There is solutions, but you do have to do something. Thank you so much for your time, guys. We're going to be spending a lot of time together over the next month or so on the course, and some of you will be joining us. Really looking forward to that. And thanks for everything that you've done over the years. I think Tony just alluded to a few things that have changed as a result of you guys and others campaigning on this issue. So thanks.
Yep, thank you. Cheers, Tommy. Thanks, Andy.